In the debate regarding the Israel Hamas conflict, we've all heard the argument, well, you're just engaging in moral equivalence. But is that true? Is that what critics are actually doing? In this episode, we dissect and get right to the heart of the matter. Let's get into it. All right. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, then I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. And yes, Keith, I will say Monday, yay. And definitely yay today because I'm going to be tackling this issue and we're going to go through a lot. Hopefully, I can even fit it in the 1 hour, but I will do my absolute best. I'm actually kind of excited about this particular episode because I've been working on it for probably close to a week now. Had to get all my notes together and kind of review some different things. Going to play a bunch of different clips today. We're going to read some things. We are going all out. I am going all, when I say we, I mean like me, myself, and I. I got a team here. We are going all out this morning to try to tackle this issue of moral equivalent. Excuse me, of moral equivalence, and specifically as it's related to the Israel Hamas conflict. Specifically, even more specifically, when criticizing Israel's response. So let's get right into it. The term moral equivalence is mentioned a lot. Ben Shapiro has on many occasions, but let's play a clip of his argument from his recent podcast episode titled Hamas Fifth Column. So let me do that. Um, Give me just a second here. I thought I had all my stuff here right there. All right. And let's bring that. There we go. All right. Um, Sorry to Ben about grabbing that particular frame at the very beginning. But anyway, let's hear what he has to say.
The world's most evil regimes have routinely relied on America's media to provide them cover, and today is no different. Hamas is an evil genocidal terrorist group, yet they receive widespread sympathy because the media create that sympathy. They do so through a variety of methods. First, and most obviously, they draw moral equivalence between Hamas, which targets civilians for death, both Israeli and its own, and Israel, which seeks to avoid killing civilians when it targets members of Hamas.
Okay. First and foremost, we need to clearly define what we mean by moral equivalence. What I prefer to do in these circumstances is use a definition that I believe will be accepted by the people that I'm criticizing. This reduces arguments over the definition. So here's what I found from Conservapedia, which I think provides a very simple and easy to understand definition. So let's go ahead and pull that up. Moral equivalence is the claim that two radically different ethical actors are really doing the same thing and that they should be judged and treated the same way. Perfect. The example in Conservapedia goes on to talk about it gives the example of two school children who are caught fighting. They are both given a similar or even the exact same punishment. However, they imagine that maybe one was a notorious bully while the other kid was simply defending themselves. Moral equivalence is to treat them both the same, maybe expel both of them, suspend both of them for the same amount of time or a similar amount of time, um, while one was the bully and one was the other just defending themselves, right? Um, and so moral equivalence, it treats them the same rather than parsing out that one forced the other into a position where they needed to respond in self defense. Therefore, it would be inappropriate. With this definition, we can now head back to Ben's comments when he says that Hamas is a quote, evil genocidal terrorist group. He won't get he'll get complete agreement from me. No argument there. But he goes on to say that they, quote, receive widespread sympathy. Now, the they in this case is Hamas, in the case that Ben is stating, right? He said Hamas is an evil genocidal terrorist group. they receive widespread sympathy. However, this is important, and this is very important for the very next portion of Ben's own podcast. Now, this next clip that I play follows the first one. So the only editing is I simply cut it so that I could play one and then play the next. So there's nothing missing between what you heard and what you're about to hear. So let's get back to that. All right. Got a lot of buttons to click on here, but we will manage just fine. All right.
Take, for example, Wolf Blitzer's questioning of an IDF commander yesterday after Israel hit a Hamas command tunnel network in Jabalia, a major city in the Gaza Strip, often characterized by the media as a refugee camp. Here's Blitzer.
But even if that Hamas commander was there amidst all those Palestinian refugees who are in that Jabalia refugee camp, Israel still went ahead and dropped a bomb there, attempting to kill this Hamas commander, knowing that a lot of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, presumably would be killed. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's not what you're hearing, Wolf. We're focused on this commander, again, who you'll get more data who this man was. Killed many, many Israelis.
But you know that there are a lot of refugees, a lot of innocent civilians, men, women, and children in that refugee camp as well, right?
This is the tragedy of war, Wolf. I mean, as you know, we've been saying for days, move south. Civilians that are not involved with Hamas, please move south.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a little bit more information. You knew there were civilians there. You knew there were refugees, all sorts of refugees, but you decided to still drop a bomb on that refugee camp, attempting to kill the Hamas commander.
That's Blitzer repeatedly blaming Israel for the fact that Hamas deliberately hides beneath civilian areas, and then calling on Israel to effectively preemptively surrender in order to avoid civilian casualties. If this were truly a civilian censor alone, massive tunnel craters simply wouldn't be there. The ground actually collapsed after the bombs hit. The craters are there. So are the dead fighters. But according to Wolf Blitzer and CNN, Israel's legitimate military actions are apparently morally equivalent to Hamas's slaughter of babies in their cribs.
Okay. So in the first clip, Ben claims that Hamas is getting widespread sympathy from the media. But in the second clip that he plays of Wolf Blitzer interviewing the IDF's international spokesperson, and in that clip, if you watch, oh yes, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes and I was trying to figure out. So he's claiming in the first clip that they're getting widespread sympathy from the media, but in the second clip, he plays clips of Wolf Blitzer interviewing the IDF's international spokesperson, and they're talking about innocent people. Now, again, if you watch Ben's show, I only cut this into different segments, so I haven't altered anything. Ben is barely a few minutes into his show, and he's deliberately misleading his audience by conflating Hamas with innocent civilians. And the IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Hecht, I believe is his name, at no time disputes that it was a refugee camp, which I believe in his clip, Ben kind of the inflection of his voice kind of suggests that maybe it wasn't a refugee camp. Whatever the case, it was the IDF spokesperson does not dispute it on the multiple times that Wolf Blitzer refers to it as a refugee camp, nor does he dispute that innocent civilians were killed. But I'm not here to walk through all of Ben's deliberate mistruths, though it might be good to remind him of his own disinformation the next time that he complains about how people falsely portray Hamas. More on that later. This episode is focused on my episode is focused on the matter of moral equivalence. So what I want to do now, I want to jump over to Dennis Prager, a good friend of Ben's, and he has also made the moral equivalence argument. In an article titled Moral Equivalence Means Only One of Two Things, Dennis leads by saying, let's pull that up on the screen for you because I have that as well. That is right here. Bam. Getting this thing right there. All right. So he says, let's bring this up. Let's bring this down a little bit. All right. So he says moral equivalence has two purposes. One is to enable the morally confused to hide their confusion. The other is to enable the immoral to hide their immorality. Now remember, We earlier defined moral equivalence as judging two parties as being morally equivalent for engaging in similar behavior. Dennis is saying when someone engages in moral equivalence, they are either confused or immoral themselves. Further into the article, he goes on to say the following. Scroll down here, that the lives of Palestinian children are as precious as those of Israeli children is a given, but it is meaningless given that virtually no Israeli or Israeli supporter has ever claimed otherwise. Indeed, it is usually worse than meaningless. It is usually a nice sounding way to attack Israel and its supporters. Here, Dennis is starting to make the same mistake that his friend Ben does by conflating innocent lives with Hamas. He said earlier that people fall into one of two categories, confused or immoral. I'm going to take a moment to disagree and say there are three types of people, and therefore three reasons why people may be engaging in so called moral equivalence. Then I'm going to show how it's actually not moral equivalence. And finally, I believe that I can show that Dennis, by his own words, somewhat agrees with me. That is, if he's willing to be honest. So, Israel has three types of critics. So, let's pull that up on the screen and let's take a look at what those types of critics might actually look like. And here we are. Boom, three critics. Those who support Hamas, like explicitly say we support Hamas, and we've seen those who support Palestinians, and those who oppose civilian deaths. Now, those who support Hamas, I'm going to say is equally vile because Hamas, as Ben Shapiro said, and I agree, they are an evil genocidal terrorist group. No dispute there. So if you explicitly support Hamas, then I'm going to say that you are in the same category as Hamas. Now, then there are those who support the Palestinians. And these are most likely taking a position on the Israel Palestine dispute over land. They may have either a limited support of Hamas or at least sympathize with them on some level. And some may not support Hamas at all. Then there are those who primarily oppose civilian deaths. That's the camp I fall into, as do many, probably most, if not all, libertarians. We neither favor Hamas nor Israel, but simply oppose actions that lead to or cause the deaths of or directly kill innocent civilians. And when those civilians are children, we really take issue because children cannot consent to Hamas leadership, meaning they have absolutely zero culpability. Like they're not even in the same camp as adults who may be fooled into supporting Hamas, but ultimately aren't themselves supporting the idea of killing innocent people, right? So the children are at the zero area for culpability. Now, if you want to learn more about the Israel Palestine dispute over land, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you look up Scott Horton or Dave Smith. Both of them have extensive knowledge. I am going to continue addressing the matter of moral equivalence. Now that we know there are three distinct groups who criticize Israeli military responses, and it's very important to make this note. There are many of us who criticize the Israeli military response. So we're not just like, oh, the Jews did it. We're not just like, oh, all of Israel is bad. We're specifically narrowing it down to the Israeli military response. So there are three groups that may criticize the military response. So let's continue with Dennis Prager's article. He goes on, and let's pull that back up on the screen. So let me get that back. There we are. All right. So he goes on, excuse me. He goes on to comment that comparing the lives, and I don't have it highlighted, that comparing the lives of Israeli children to Palestinian children is meaningless by comparing it to actions in World War II. In other words, he asked questions like, should we have bombed places that we knew there to be civilians in Germany? Or what about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Dennis argues that by doing so, fewer overall lives were killed in both Japan and America. First, we can speculate about what should have or what would have happened historically, but often that's just speculation. Second, Us anti-war libertarians, well, we oppose indiscriminate killing of civilians in those situations as well. So not going to work here, Mr. Dennis. This is where Dennis starts to agree with me. He goes on to say, let me scroll down here because we're not going to read the whole article. He goes on to say, the same holds true for those who now assert that Israeli and Palestinian children are equally precious. Given that the Palestinian regime in Gaza, i.e., Hamas, is dedicated to murdering every Jew in Israel, great grandmothers down to infants, given that Hamas and all their Muslim and non Muslim left wing supporters around the world seek to annihilate the nation of Israel, given that Israel has almost uniquely among the nations regularly warned Gaza civilians to evacuate buildings that Israel planned to bomb, thereby losing the advantage of surprise attack on Hamas operatives. And given that Hamas places its leaders and weapons in schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings for the express purpose of bringing death down on women and children, what do those who assert that Israeli and Palestinian babies are equally precious seek to accomplish? All right. So, excuse me. Uh, He starts the article claiming the only reason to engage in moral equivalence is out of ignorance or confusion or immorality. He later states that comparing innocent Palestinian lives to innocent Israeli lives is, quote, usually a nice sounding way to attack Israel and its supporters. That puts people into two categories: support Israel or criticize them. But now he acknowledges, did I read that right? Yes. But now he acknowledges that there is a circumstance under which announcing equality between innocent lives has merit. Like Ben, Dennis is playing loose with the moral bearings here. It is a series of mental acrobatics to shield Israel from any criticism, regardless if that criticism comes from an honest place or not. I've not seen a lot from Dennis, but I have seen Ben repeatedly accuse critics of being anti Semites and a whole bunch of other nasty names. We've not been having an honest conversation. Well, now we are, and such accusations will not work here. Sorry, folks. Looking at my notes, I put a lot of effort into this, and so I'm trying to make sure that my notes make sense. And sometimes when I'm reading them, after the fact, I'm like, wait a minute, does that make same sense that it did earlier? So sometimes I get a little bit confused here. So I apologize, folks, but I'm working really hard. Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on here. Let me bring the screen back. There's a lot of things going on here. Could totally use a producer, but I don't have one. That's the way life goes. Anyway, so here's where it gets interesting. Dennis has this series called Fireside Chat, where he literally sits in front of a fireplace and records a podcast. In episode number 78, titled Save Your Dog or Save a Stranger, he discusses responses to a moral dilemma that he's presented to people for many decades. The moral dilemma goes like this: if your personal dog, your dog, and a stranger, somebody that you didn't know, were both drowning, which would you save first? Now, he notes that the answers have been consistent over many years that he's been asking this. And he's been asking for I think he claims like over 20 years or something, 20 or 30 years. One third say that they would save their dog. One third say they would save the stranger. And one third are unsure. He laments that two-thirds of the people don't know that saving the stranger is the right answer. By the way, I agree. That is the right answer. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip where he's reading a user comment. So they have on their website some user comments about this particular moral dilemma. And then he goes ahead and responds. His response is rather interesting. So let's go ahead and pull up this clip and hear what he has to say.
I would never sacrifice my dog for someone I do not know. My dog is my family. As a matter of fact, I would throw a stranger in front of a moving bus to save my dog. All right, first of all, that second part is a little scary. You would throw a human being in front of a moving bus to save your dog?
Agreed, that's scary.
You would murder a human to save your dog? By the way, in religious law, Judeo-Christian law, you can't murder a human to save your mother. Forget your dog. You can't throw a human in front of a bus to save your own child. That's murder. You can't murder to save somebody. You can kill someone going to kill your child, of course. That's self-defense. That's a separate issue. But this is a scary thing. This is what happens when the heart takes over morality. I would murder a person in order to save my dog. So, okay, so this is clearly an example of the heart is the source of values. But where do you end? What if your heart is, I don't like women? And I would save a man, but not a woman. What would you say to that? What if somebody, or the other way around, a woman in solidarity with women? Oh, well, if the person drowning were a woman, I would save the woman. But if it's a man, I'm going to save my dog. What would you say to that? Or black or white, or your nationality and another nationality. What if the only thing you knew was let's say you're French and you knew the stranger were French? Oh, then you would save the person. I mean, that's why feelings cannot be the source of values. There's got to be a right and a wrong.
I agree. There has to be a right and a wrong. And Dennis is right to ask where it ends. He's not wrong for being concerned about a person saying they would throw a stranger in front of a moving bus to save their dog. And he's not wrong to make the comparison that he does here. I would simply make one more. What if your heart is that you prefer Israeli children over Palestinian children? Dennis goes on to point out other analogies, and he makes this very interesting point for which I agree with. So let me play clip 2.
How do we derive good and evil? How do we arrive at good and evil, right and wrong? It can't be the heart. There has to be a transcendent code to which we are all obligated.
All right. He's right. There needs to be a transcendent code that obligates us all. Unfortunately, Dennis and many other conservatives, along with people who aren't conservatives, they check their moral code at the door when it comes to war. For libertarians, it's self-ownership. Each person owns themselves and has their full right to make consenting decisions. They have the right to not be aggressed upon, which means my neighbor does not have the right to come over and attack me. If they do, I have the right to defend myself. Now, I want to jump over to a clip of Dave Smith responding to Yaron Brook, an objectivist over at the Ayn Rand Institute, because this is not limited to conservatives. Yaron went on a video rant about Dave and libertarians in general, and then Dave responded. Yaron's rant is basically about our objections to war and our concern with the innocents. So let's go ahead and let's play what Yaron says, because this gets to the heart of the matter.
Let's keep playing. A complete moral equivalency between the two.
Is that word?
I'm a collectivist because I want to defend myself, and I'm not going to actually go through a questionnaire to see who's innocent and who's not in defending myself. I'm actually going to go out there and defend myself.
Let's pause it right there. Okay. First of all, he keeps going back to this thing like, is it an equivalency, or am I saying that Israel's worse because they're the state? You got to pick one here, buddy. This is like logic 101. Number two, and this is really the heart of the issue. He says, I want to defend myself, and I don't feel like going through a questionnaire figuring out who's innocent and who's not innocent. Okay. Again, you are contradicting yourself left and right. Here's the issue with not figuring out who's innocent and who's not innocent, right? Isn't this really basic 101 stuff? If you're attacking innocent people, then you're not defending yourself. That's the difference. If I want to defend myself and I don't have time to figure out who's attacking me and who's not attacking me, I'm just going to kill. It's like, oh, okay, but that's not defending yourself. Now, in fact, you're aggressing upon people who have a right to defend themselves. See, you do have a right to defend yourself. You don't have a right to attack innocent people. And if you do, they have a right to defend themselves. That's the whole heart of the matter here. He just doesn't care. I don't care. I don't have time to answer a question here about who's innocent and who's guilty. We'll just start killing people. Okay. Well, what does that make you? Not someone defending themselves.
Okay. So Dave nails it. And for the very reason that I just said, self-ownership. And he acknowledges that people have the right to defend themselves, including Israel. Often people will ask, well, doesn't Israel have a right to defend themselves? The answer is yes, they do. But they don't have the right to kill innocent people any more than Hamas has the right to kill innocent people. Now, I didn't pull the clip, but Dave goes on. He goes into why this isn't moral relativism, as is claimed by Dennis, Ben, Yaron, and many others, actually, but adhering to a moral standard, or as we just saw Dennis state, a transcendent code which we are all obligated to. That transcendent code is that each person owns their own self and has the right to not be attacked or aggressed upon, as libertarians frequently stated. That's the word we tend to use, is aggressed. When viewed as a matter of self-ownership, this is not an issue of moral equivalence, but value equivalence. Innocent human lives in Israel have the same value as innocent human lives in Palestine. And it's of vital importance that we recognize this. This is why we have to make the distinction between Hamas and innocent Palestinians. This is why earlier I criticized Ben when he says, well, Hamas gets all this, the media is sympathizing with Hamas left and right. But then he goes to a clip where the media is actually not talking about Hamas. They're talking about innocent human lives. Now, again, the media may have different underlying foundation why they want to talk about innocent lives. Me and other libertarians, we want to talk about innocent human lives because we believe that every single person owns their own self. Others may want to talk about innocent human lives because maybe they're taking a stand in the Israel Palestine dispute over land. Maybe they do hate Jewish people. Maybe they don't like Israel. Maybe they do stand explicitly with Palestine. Or maybe, and in some cases, as we've seen, people are taking a stand and talking about innocent human lives because they support Hamas. Okay. But that's not where I'm coming from. And so for somebody like Dennis to limit this down to, okay, well, you're engaging in moral equivalence, which is not correct. And then to go further and say the only reason that you might even bring this up is because you're either confused or immoral is incorrect. And that's the nice way to put it. All right. So let's go on. Those who defend the loss of human innocent lives during war fail to show the morality of knowingly killing them. And it is knowingly. In the interview between Wolf Blitzer and the IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Hecht does not dispute that Israel's strike on the refugee camp killed innocent Palestinians, nor does he dispute that Israel knew that it would before striking. He goes on to say that they gave advanced warning, as if telling people you were about to drop a bomb on their head absolves you of any moral failing for killing them. And Israel supporters are happy to let you know that they drop leaflets. We hear about it all the time. Well, Israel is, they're one of the only countries in the world who do this. Okay, well, guess what? Being the only one to forewarn people is not the same as taking measures to prevent the loss of innocent life. And in this case, I'm not even sure that it qualifies to be a measure to prevent the loss of innocent life. Since supporters, though, are so want to tell us about the leaflets, then let's ask a couple of obvious questions. If Hamas is hiding behind innocent lives, as we all agree, even the Ben Shapiro's of the world, the Dennis Prager's of the world, the Yarn Brooks, those folk, they agree. We all agree Hamas hides behind innocent lives. Well, then it's safe to conclude that innocent Palestinians might not want to be there or are not there necessarily on their own free will. Now, it depends. Do they know that Hamas is hiding there? Do they know there are tunnels? I don't know. But whether or not they know that the Hamas is there, it doesn't guarantee that they're there on their own free will. Think about it. What is claimed is that Hamas hides behind them, not that Palestinians jump in front of them. If you aren't somewhere on your own free will, knowingly, you know the circumstances, then what's a leaflet to do? Second of all, if leaflets are dropped giving innocent Palestinians time to evacuate, then isn't it also the case that Hamas has time to evacuate themselves? Surely they can read the same leaflets, right? I mean, think about it. I think it was in the article that Dennis Prager wrote. He points out that there's a loss of. He talks about Israel when they drop the leaflets. There's a loss of their surprise attack. Well, when there's that loss, then maybe Hamas has time to evacuate, and so therefore the the large number of casualties happen to just be innocent civilians. And since we know that Hamas is willing to die for their cause, and they're willing to sacrifice Palestinian lives for their cause. Remember, they're sacrificing them. Palestinian lives aren't necessarily they're not necessarily sacrificing their own lives. And in that case, it's reasonable to say that low-level Hamas fighters might be the ones that are staying with innocent Palestinians who are again against their own will. Or worse, they don't even know that there are people below them, right? Like as Ben was talking about tunnels that were below the Jabalia refugee camp. These are the kind of questions that you ask when you actually care about innocent lives, when you have a consistent moral code that you're obligated to. When you don't, you pretzel yourself into all sorts of poor logic to justify why knowingly or indiscriminately killing one innocent life is morally acceptable. You'll use insult, as we frequently see with Ben Shapiro, calling people things like Jew haters and anti Semites. You'll reduce concerns about innocent life down to questionnaires that you've no time to fill out, like Yarnbrook. You'll even accuse critics of being confused or simply immoral, as Dennis Prager does. You'll claim that critics just hate Israel and are engaging in moral equivalence, as all three have. Speaking of moral equivalence, worth making a point about that. In an Intercept article titled Ilhan Omar and Moral Equivalence, a term of propaganda invented in the 1990s, writer John Schwartz makes the following claim about the term moral equivalence that I find very interesting. Let's pull that up and take a look at it and see what he has to say. We're just going to read it very quickly. We're not going to read the whole article. Moral equivalence is a propaganda term invented in the 1980s to shield the Reagan administration from criticism over its extraordinarily brutal policies in Central America and elsewhere. The phrase's sudden rise to ubiquity can be followed via Google's Ngram viewer, which allows users to see the frequency which words have appeared in books over the past several hundred years. Moral equivalence was barely used in the English language before Ronald Reagan was elected. It has since exploded into popularity. And then he puts a screenshot of the Google Ngram viewer. And we can see down here that from 1800 all the way to 1980, the word moral equivalence is like barely used. It's very consistent. But then all of a sudden, it spikes up here in the 1980s. And then it spikes up again here in the 2000s. And then it looks like it doesn't really go much more than maybe about 2010, maybe 2020. So it drops down a little bit, but then we see a little bit of an arc. Now, whether this is factually true is not something that I had time to dig in for this particular episode. However, I did check out Google's Ngram viewer myself, and I've typed in the word or the term, and it is accurate. It does show that, like the same. I got the same graph with it was pretty simple. You just type in the word, you hit go, and you can see the graph right there. So we do see a spike starting in the 1980s, as is claimed by the writer of the Intercept article. And the graph he shows is the same one that I found. But I want to leave you with this. We all know that governments have a tendency to engage in immoral actions. History has provided example after example after example. No state entity is exempt. So then, why does it seem that this is the time when a state entity, the government of Israel, the military of Israel, is not. How is it that all of a sudden, this time around, they may not be engaging in any immoral actions and everybody else is wrong, even though governments historically have given us example after example, every single one of them? It sure feels like the term moral equivalence is being used to shield Israel from criticism. Supporters spend a great deal of time arguing over any and every point. But what I haven't seen them say is something like, well, while I agree with the overall effort, I admit they were wrong here and Israel should be held accountable. They never say something like that. They never suggest where criticizing Israel might be appropriate, might be reasonable, might be moral. They just dismiss all of it. They put a great deal of effort into doing that. It is eerily familiar with the many minority groups that conservatives have criticized over time, sometimes rightfully. They too once found themselves fighting arguments that appeared to shield groups from criticism. And it appears they have picked up on this tactic. I guess we've found the moral code that obligates them. Win at any cost, even the cost of thousands of lives. All right. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a lot of fun putting it together. I stumbled there was a few moments where I stumbled, but hopefully you got the message. I want you to be sure to catch me every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again on Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co host, Susan Hogarth. We are going to look across the vast tyranny that is here in the United States, and we are going to discuss LP happenings. We did so last night, and we had a lot to report on. It was actually really exciting. It was great last night to know that I had to kind of rush through all the LP happenings because I might not be able to get to them all if I didn't go quickly. So that was great. So LP affiliates out there, state, local, make sure that you update your websites so that when I go hunting, I can find them. But more importantly, when other people go hunting, they can find them and give people that excitement that things are happening in the Libertarian Party. Be sure to do all the proper audience actions. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Uh, go on over to youtube.libertydad.com or go to rumble.libertydad.com. Do all the cool and proper audience actions. Subscribe to my channels, like the videos, ring bells, and most definitely drop a word or two in the comment section. I do try to read the comments as much as I can. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can do so at Liberty Dad on Facebook, Liberty Dad Pod on Twitter, or email to libertydadpodcast@gmail.com because I would love to hear from you. And finally, remember that if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people. I almost said champion of people. If you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week, but I'm going to catch you tomorrow. For now,